Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who want their artificial intelligence to sound exactly like their weird uncle after 3 martinis. Each month we spin the wheel and land on a different genre, topic, or idea. And right now we are reading stories about immortality, including this one, Robert Heinlein's Time Enough for Love. I'm Zach, and this week I'm really interested in what the Heinlein calls the Scheherazade style of the story, the frame, the narrative, and whether it lives up to that characterization.
1001 nights of reading Heinlein. I'm Bob. I'm interested in what we talk about when we talk about Heinlein. Now, I'm interested a lot in changes in values, especially to reactions to this book and to Heinlein in general, but through time. And I think that's very relevant to this book because in this book, it's many different generations, but that is everyone's experience anyway. That is our experience of immortality because we're always surrounded by generations before us and generations after us, always living together, and those values are always changing.
I like what you're saying about the reception of this book because, you know, in a sense, I almost feel like I could spend this entire episode talking about the reception of this book far more easily. I mean, in much greater depth and interest than I could talking about the book itself. I'm going to resist that urge, but, you know, before going in, I will say this is my first time reading Robert A. Heinlein. So I have a very new relationship with him. I am aware that this is, you know, really the later period of his writing, the 1970s. He really made his fame, you know, maybe a decade and a half earlier. And is also the capstone of his future history series, many of these books do star Lazarus Long, the protagonist of this book. So there's a sense in which I feel like I am a novice walking into a conversation that's been going on for a long time, basically. It's been going on for a long time without me. But I don't want to say that as a way to like invalidate my feelings on the novel. On the contrary, I do think that like my gut reaction to what's going on here, to Heinlein's own perspectives, to the readers and all of their reviews that I read, and the hardline stances they take, you know, either very, very positive or very, very negative. It's just such an interesting world to piece together for the first time.
It's very polarizing, Heinlein. I think even though it's really easy to say, oh my God, there's so many things in this book that are so offensive and, you know, never to read it, but I still think it's worth reading and there's many interesting ideas I'd like to talk about. Heinlein's actually really important for me. As you know, I did not read a single book in high school because I was a big idiot. Now I'm slightly less of a big idiot, but I think the very first 2 science fiction books that I ever read one was Ender's Game. You know, people got problems with that book too. And then the second was Starship Troopers, and I thought they were both just awesome. One of the maybe 3rd, 4th, or 5th was Stranger in a Strange Land because I wanted to read Heinlein again. You know, that's at the very beginning of college. I think now I would probably not be as interested in those books, but I was blown away by the writing when I read them. And I would like to kind of think about how this book feels very different to me. It feels very familiar, but I think it feels very different in what he is bringing to the table. In the past, great style, brings you right in. This, he's not quite doing it for me.
Well, okay, so I would love to compare the voice in this book with the voice that you found in Starship Troopers. Obviously, I've seen the movie. Everyone's seen the movie. It's, you know, and it's a very funny and incisive movie for sure. But I'm curious about the authorial voice within Stranger in a Strange Land and Starship Troopers, because in this book, Lazarus Long, our character who we're with for so many pages, I started to realize about halfway through, I think during like the notebook section where he's actually giving aphorisms, that this isn't like a character in the sense of like Daniel Day-Lewis and There Will Be Blood becoming Daniel Plainview, you know, it's not like a fundamentally different character. It became very clear to me that this is like Robert Heinlein's like what Freud would call like the ego ideal, the self that he wished he was, or the self that he wants to be. He's writing himself into this story. I'm wondering if this is like a late career development, or if this is a voice that he has had and that like maybe a representative character has had in previous books.
It's in a lot of the books. In Stranger in a Strange Land, there's a character named Harshaw. He's a lawyer, and he's representing Smith, who is the Martian who comes down to Earth. That's where we get Grok, by the way, that Elon Musk is using for his AI, Grok. When you Grok, you're really communicating with someone telepathically, but you also just get them, you Grok them, But Harshaw, he is similar to Lazarus Long, where he's bossing people around a lot. He gives long lectures, but that book is quite a bit shorter, and it feels like the characters are quite a bit different. I feel like there are ideas in that just got expanded, like not enough butter over too much bread, in this. It just keeps going and going and going. And to me, what's really missing is when we had Smith, he's a very different kind of character. We had Harshaw, we had all of the other characters kind of around them at their weird, sexy pool parties. But here, it's basically, to me, it feels just like Lazarus Long lecturing people, and then people next to Lazarus Long who could say, yes, you're so right. You're 100% right, Lazarus. Tell me again for 60 or 70 pages, please. So while this is a very beloved book, it's got lots of awards. I think, let's see, on Goodreads, it's got like 4.3 or something like that, 4 out of 5. 89% of people like it on Google users. So it's very beloved, and it won a lot of awards.
Hold on. Pause real quick. So for contrast, Tolstoy's War and Peace has a 4.17. So this is, slightly more beloved. So only slightly more beloved than War and Peace.
I don't know what to say after that. That's just, whoa.
Well, just to get it out of the way, I do feel like we should make some semblance of an attempt at describing what happens in this book, though I do think that the actual contents of what happens, isn't the most interesting or pertinent thing for us to talk about. And if people, want a review of what happens, like every YouTube video I've seen on this book covers in detail everything that happens. But, the basic idea is you have Lazarus Long, who has been alive for more than 2,000 years at this point, and he's pretty much done with his life. But the foundation, made up of people who are essentially all his descendants, want to keep him alive, basically because they want his historical perspective. They want knowledge from him. He seems to be a kind of figurehead, a champion for their foundation that's going on. But the general move is that he no longer wants to live. So they are trying to get him to talk about his past. So what you have is a kind of frame story of him on the spaceship, and then giving episodes from his life. You get moments of him, settling a planet, and it becomes a kind of like space western at that point, settling the frontier. You get the story of a young man, presumably him in the military, who doesn't want to work. So he always chooses the laziest method, which also happens to be a way of increasing efficiency. It's really kind of like a Bildungsroman is what he's doing there. Time travel is introduced. He goes back in time, meets his mother, and then you get a kind of like forbidden romance that happens. So what this book is doing is giving all of these different short stories that are cycling through and really alluding to various different genres, different pieces of genre fiction, but putting it within this science fiction frame story. Obviously, other things happen. That was like the barest bones of it. But I want to know for you, like as a frame story, as a collection, what did you think of this? Was the construction working for it?
Is this construction working? Okay, so I've read it twice now. The first time I read it, I thought it was just terrible. I was like, this is the worst book I've ever read. I reread it and I thought, actually, there is a lot that's very interesting about this book, and it is definitely worth talking about. I still would not say it's necessarily worth reading. I think some of his other books are more worth reading, but I think it is very interesting and it's provocative in a way that I think is effective because it's going to get us to have an interesting conversation. As far as a structure, it's interesting because you see Lazarus Long through so many different periods of his life, but again, these are not really stories. They're just lectures with fake dialogue going on to keep the stories going. But it's kind of fun to see him as a character whose values never, ever, ever change. And even though he's going to completely different places, to completely different times, times, because he's traveling back and forth in time, it's interesting to see him always constant. You know, he only has the same idea. He has the same opinions. He has little tiny changes, but not really. It's always aligning with who he believes he is. So I think that is a very interesting part, where it's the Scheherazade story of 2,000 years of one person basically remaining exactly the same. And it's nuts, too, the reason they call him there, because he is so set in his ways. They are calling him not just to know his stories, they're also calling him for advice on putting down a democracy, because his descendant is kind of like an autocratic leader. It's like, people are starting to rebel. They want to build a democracy. So he's going to interview his, 2,000 years ago grandfather about how to put down democracy.
So there's one thread I really want to pick up, which is the idea that as a character, he never changes. And I think that you might fundamentally be onto something, but I actually think this is more of an issue with the immortality story in general than it might be with Heinlein. Previously, we had read Paul Anderson's The Boat of a Million Years, which features several immortal characters, tracing them through the dawns of, the dawn of human history all the way up into the spacefaring age, where, the first contact with an alien race. And there came a certain point in that book where all of the characters kind of crystallized into who they were, into, I guess we could say, stereotypes of the time and place they came from. So, you had, for example, the guy from ancient China, and no matter what year it was, he was always kind of the guy who was from ancient China. Then the Native American guy, everyone was someone from some period or place in human history. We identified that as like I don't want to say a fault, but kind of like an uncomfortable thing, because it's like, surely if you're living for thousands and thousands of years and you are moving from place to place and meeting all these people, surely you are in a constant state of flux for your personal identity. So what this book did, coming back to Heinlein, is it gives us really one character. We are following one character. And I do get the sense that this character has everything figured out at the start of the book. And an interesting way to write this could have been, in the frame story, he has everything figured out. And then in our sub-stories, in our nested stories, is an opportunity for us to learn with him all of his insights, to go through some trial and struggle, and he comes out with some insight, and then he says, and that's how I learned why you should never do blah, blah, blah. But that's not actually the case, because in all of these sub-stories, it's just that same character with those same ideas and that same voice and that same perspective. He's kind of just, he's a force of nature. He's not really a character. He's just a force of nature.
Which is why I think it's so interesting, because he's a force of nature. It doesn't make any sense to not change or to not budge or to not compromise. There are fake little compromises, but they're such small things. I think he does something, though. Heinlein does something that I was hoping Paul Anderson would do, where he says, okay, look, we're going to experiment and see what happens to childhood memories or formative memories that should be, that we should never lose. Because he's been around for 2,000 years. When he goes back in time at one point, he wants to go back for like a nostalgia trip. It turns out very weird, but he goes back in time to 1919, I think in Kansas. Anyway, where he's from, and he goes and tries to meet his family. He's kind of pretending that he's some just stranger. He's like, I'm orphaned. I don't know who my parents were. I don't even know how old I am, but everyone could tell, you look just like me, dude. Why are you suddenly here? And you look just like my brother. But at one point he says, okay, it only took me about 3 days or not even a week to get back my accent. And now it's just natural. He said he calls it a corn feed accent, I think, or hayseed accent. So he says, that proves it to me. Our childhood memories never leave us. I thought that was great. He also talks about at one point, about in the middle of the book, he says, when he's doing all these reminiscences and he's saying, okay, this happened, this happened, this happened. But then at one point he questions himself and he says, wait a second, is that a memory or a memory of a memory of a memory of a memory of a memory? And he tells us, okay, we form our memories because we think about them again and again and again. And I can't even prove anymore if my recollection of that memory is accurate. I liked how Heinlein handled that in this book, and Paul Anderson did not.
Absolutely. And we just read Borges's The Immortal, Jorge Luis Borges, The Immortal. And in that, you get a very similar dissolution of the self. He becomes immortal, and then time just dissolves away his mental abilities and his body in a weird way. Like, they just lose all will to live, him and everyone else who has gone to this immortal city. And honestly, like, I think that of the stories about immortality we've read, I think that this is like the most poignant insight that all of these authors are working with. I mean, if we want to talk about this strictly as an immortality story, it's just that it just makes me feel like we need death. All of these characters who are they're clamoring for death at the end. And there's a sense in which the cell, the human body, all the businesses, governments, societies, all of these things have a natural life cycle. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And what you have in this story is like basically an ego that has grown cancerous. You know what I mean? And he even describes himself as a kind of narcissus at some point, but he grows and he grows and he grows and he reproduces and he reproduces. And, the people who he's falling in love with, clones of himself, his own mother, in AI, which actually I think is probably worth discovering or discussing a little bit more, but like there's something so ego reinforcing and ego gratifying about all of his choices about who he falls in love with. But I can't help but feel like all of them are just mirrors of his own self,
I loved what you just said, Zach. I want to come back to mirrors. I got a theory, Zach, but I think this will, if we haven't gotten canned yet, we're going to get canned now. I can give you a template if you want to comment. Give these guys a microphone and they don't even know what they're talking about. There you go.
Let's do it.
What I think, let's go. I think what is missing in the story is death drive. It's only Eros constantly. And to me, this book feels like, this is where we get in trouble. It just feels like the Teletubbies. But the Teletubbies who are only thinking about sex all the time. They're so supportive. It's like do you know the theme song from Barney? I love you, you love me. That is this book for 1,000, whatever, 800 pages. It's so saccharinely positive, and it's all about building family, but it's not really. It's just about Lazarus bossing people around, telling them how to be a family. The other weird thing is, you said it's like looking into a mirror. He calls himself Narcissus a few times in this, and he calls himself a solipsist many times. And I think that we have to come back to this because this is a huge thing for Heinlein. But he is so interested in his own genetics. And that's what everyone is after. They're all wanting to have sex with him because they want these genes that will make them live forever. He just never dies. He stays at what is like 35, 45, around there. And he has to fake dye his hair gray to look like he's aging. But everyone is obsessed with his genes. He is obsessed with his genes. And now almost like 80% of the universe is a descendant from him. It's weird. And every encounter, every sexual encounter is like solipsism. It's always about looking at himself in the mirror and being turned on by it. It's also every dialogue is, look at me, I'm going to tell you how to live, and you're going to tell me yes.
And to extend what you're saying further, people always talk about, like with ChatGPT or any other large language model, the idea that, there's no personality behind it. It's mirroring back yourself. This idea that whatever you put into it is what you'll get back. And that's why they can be so addictive. But something really wise was said in this, which was he's talking to his AI, and she says, I have read everything in the great library. In one sense, I am the library, Lazarus. And this idea that like artificial intelligence really like becomes the persona of whatever archive it's trained upon. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, I thought that his relationship with that AI persona was actually much more pure and poetic, I guess I could say, than any of the other relationships he has, because, it's the conflict between self and world. And when everything in this story is an extension of self, and yet there's all of human history there. So in a sense, wrapping all of human literary culture and historical record and art and thought into one AI persona and then having sex with it. There's something just a little like, I don't know, just, it's sweet. It's just sweet.
It's just sweet. Okay. I wasn't expecting it to go that direction. I really like this too. And I think he's actually saying something very fresh here. And he lets Minerva say it. Minerva is the ship computer that eventually decides, okay, I'm going to become flesh and blood. And she's really interesting because she knows that becoming flesh and blood, she will have to discard a lot of her memory. A lot of it's going to be gone. And at one point she tells us, okay, I used to know how I did all of these transfers, how I did these crazy maneuvers, but now I just know that I did that and I can't actually do it because everything has been put into this kind of human brain. There's just not enough space. There's not enough hard drive. But she also says that she's self-aware and she explains why. And I think this is very interesting. She says, this other computer scientist who worked with her before explains his theory. And she says, no, that's not at all correct. She says, how a computer becomes self-aware actually remains a complete mystery. If it is designed for inductive logic, able to assess data, draw hypotheses therefrom, test them, reconstruct them to fit new data, make random comparisons of the results, and change those reconstructions, exercise the judgment the way a flesh and blood does, then self-awareness may occur. So she's saying, okay, I'm thinking this way, and now I can tell you, like, I am self-aware and I know that I'm a person, but we don't know really how it came to be. It just happened. It's not just because we put a computer into a flesh and blood body. Something happened to me, and I can tell you that I'm self-aware. I thought that was very interesting, creating this Minerva character who has this new theory of what it means for a computer to be aware.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that we should keep this in the back of our mind for when we read artificial intelligence books in the future, because that moment, I guess, of crossing the gap between just being a bundle of information to being something that has the ability of experiencing, or at least has the sense of selfhood, is super, super interesting. But speaking of like how computers in this seem to have like a sense of soul, a sense of self, the animals too. We have a donkey that speaks human language.
I love that donkey, Zach. I'm very glad you brought it up. This donkey is so interesting. His name is Buck. There's so many pieces to explain in this story, but Lazarus saves this girl when she's a girl from a fire. Her parents both die, saves her, raises her, and then they end up in love. But they go traveling together, but they end up basically on the Oregon Trail. They have Buck the donkey, and the donkey for some reason speaks, as you said. But my favorite part is when poor Buck, it's kind of sad, actually. That is a sad part of this book. Buck gets really old and tired, and eventually they're going to have to... Anyway, he points...
You know what happens to Buck.
We know what happens. It's just hard to say. So Lazarus points up where they're going to go, where there's going to be their new homestead. And he says, Buck, imagine Lazarus is often wearing a kilt and has a goatee. So just imagine someone like that. Buck, I said, pointing, that's our home out there. We made it. Homeboy farm. And Buck, it says, Buck looked over the valley and just says, okay. And that's his last word before he dies. Poor Buck the donkey.
Oh my God. Yeah, the audiobook narration of this really added a lot of texture to that scene. I couldn't believe it. Well, I kind of want to talk about really the only thing that people talk about when they talk about this book, which is the sex. Robert Heinlein had a lot of things to say about sex, and it seems like he really wanted this book to be to convince people of something. I'm not really sure what he was trying. We can talk about what he wanted to do with this book. I think that's what we need to do, because I think it's hard for me to speculate what his goal was. People talk about this as being more of a philosophical treatise than a novel. I read those words. I kid you not. But if that's the case, if Heinlein fans want to frame this as more of a philosophic treatise than a story, fine. But what is he trying to do with it is a question in my mind.
I am so into this. I'm not into the sex of this book, but I'm really interested that it's included in this book. It's not sexy. I mean, it's very horny, but it's not sexy. We've read, some erotica books, and somehow it just doesn't hit like those do, like Lila Sage or Emily Henry. Those are sexy. This is not. But it's very strange. And I think this is maybe where it gets to high art, because when you think about this kind of weird love at the end of this book, I mean, that's Oedipus Rex. That's Sophocles. That is that is high art right there, Zach. So I'm interested that he included it, because I think one thing that he's always talking about in this book is there is no reason to have these mores. There's no reason to have these taboos. This taboo is only because breeding might make it dangerous. But if we can make it not dangerous, there's no reason to have the taboo. That's again why it seems like it has no death drive. It's all just love drive, all just eros, because it's so there's no neurosis. It's like he's trying to eliminate all neuroses completely, because Lazarus Long has no doubts in his mind ever. He is the least neurotic character, but maybe very neurotic in real, but the way he's portrayed is having no neurosis at all. And I think that is a big part of why the sex is so free, so talked about, non-neurotic, and not sexy.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny. I thought the exact same thing about this book with the neurosis stuff. I'm glad you mentioned Oedipus Rex, because Oedipus Rex, after he learns that he has broken the most sacred taboo of any and all societies, he takes knives and he blinds himself with a knife. Crazy work, but the work of someone racked with anxiety and guilt and fundamentally neurosis. So it seems like if I had to put a thesis statement on this book, it would seem to be that human psychology would rid itself of neurosis if people had more guilt-free sex, I guess you could say. But honestly, the experience of reading this was a dystopia. I mean, it was a nightmare to get through these sexual relationships, because I think what I've fundamentally learned, maybe about myself, maybe as a core human truth of all humanity, is that without any kind of like taboo or neurosis, it's not sexy. It's just people exchanging money, or, people trading Pokemon cards, but Pokemon cards are body fluids, there has to be something. There needs to be some reason why we can't do this. And maybe that's why, he included that bit about, like, he turned the final part with the mother into a cheating narrative. Oh, she's cheating on him with his dad, or he's cheating on his dad with him. But then it turned out to be, it's not, but then it turned out to be not a problem, because they were in a kind of open relationship. This book taught me truths about the human soul, but it was the exact opposite truths that Robert Heinlein set out to teach.
So far as we know, maybe his goal has been met. I'm not sure. Interestingly, this won the 1998 Prometheus Hall of Fame award, and I think Heinlein is he's the record holder for most wins, or he's at least tied with Clarke and Asimov for that company. Now, the Prometheus Hall of Fame award, it's like a guild or a club of libertarian science fiction people. Now, when they reviewed this book, they said, okay, the beginning is, who has time enough for love? For starters, fans of Robert Heinlein do, despite the epic's novel length. But then he goes, okay, so do freedom lovers who understand that freedom itself is a necessary but not sufficient prerequisite for human flourishing, human happiness, and the fulfillment possible in life largely through love, family, creativity, and achievement. Yet anyone who appreciates visionary science fiction by one of the 20th century's grandmasters can enjoy Heinlein's longest and most ambitious work. So this award was given to him because it is about freedom. And I think you're right. It is about a free love that will end all neuroses. Now, not necessary to really read into Heinlein's life, but most of his marriages, I think all of them were open. It was always like, okay, we're going to have an open marriage, just like all of the relationships in this book. We can't really say that he's Lazarus Long, but when this character keeps coming back and back and back and back, maybe he's kind of a mouthpiece for him. Hard to say. But I think here's where I think we're really getting into weird territory. the whole thing is weird territory. But when he talks about libertarianism and freedom, I think he is talking in a different way than a lot of people do. He is very interested in solipsism, which is the idea of I only exist and everything else is basically a projection of my own mind. Whatever I think is true is probably true. And that's what Lazarus Long feels like. He's always telling people what the truth is, and they say, oh, yes, you're right. And then they agree and they go forward. Now, here's some weird proofs of that, because Heinlein was really interested in this idea. Solipsism occurs in the book many, 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 many times in all of the chapters. But he says that solipsism and libertarianism is not about freedom. It's about believing that you're right no matter what. I think that's what he's trying to get at. It's always about believing that you're right no matter what. He says at one point, Lazarus Long is a law unto himself. He says, I'm a solipsist at heart, Lazarus Long does. He says, when he's first talking about David, who is actually Lazarus, the military story, when he tries to be a pilot and fails, David has always followed his own opinion against the whole world if necessary. Now, Heinlein was really interested in the idea of solipsism. He says in 1955, he wrote a letter, he said, I have had a dirty suspicion since I was about 6 that all consciousness is one, and that all the actors I see around me are myself at different points in the record's grooves. So I think when other people say libertarianism, it might be, freedom, blah, blah, blah. When he says it, it's I am the only thing that really exists. And I think that's a little bit dangerous.
Honestly, I love it. And, I want to get that out there because this vision of Robert Heinlein that you've sketched out for me is one that I'm like fundamentally quite charmed by. You know what I mean? Like these are all very interesting ideas. And honestly, I'm not mad at the book for having ideas. I'm not mad at the book. A lot of people, and I hate to straw man an entire, segment of readership, but I've read a lot of really negative reviews of this book. But it seems like people are more mad about the book for having wrong or weird ideas. I'm not mad about that. I love that Robert Heinlein has these like awesome, solipsistic ideas. It's almost a kind of like magical thinking. You know what I mean? Whatever I say is true, whatever I declare is true. And I'm going to live like that. And in writing this character, he's imagined a world in which that is more or less the case. If this idea that there's only Robert in his universe and that he as an author is not only writing works, but also writing his own life, that everyone else is just, everyone in the real world is just a projection of his own creative self. That's fascinating. And if he has other books like that, I absolutely want to read them. And maybe that's only stuff that you get from the letters of the archives. I don't know. Robert Heinlein fans can let me know in the comment, but I'm in,
Well, you've got a lot ahead of you, Zach. You have Methuselah's children. You have the number of the beast. You have the cat who walks through walls. You have to sail beyond the sunset. And you have the notebooks of Lazarus Long. You got a long, long road ahead. I think it would be a lot more fun if the solipsism, or at least believing whatever you say is true, was more like Baudolino. I thought that was great. When Baudolino is saying, look, unicorns exist. I've seen them. This other crazy creature exists. I've seen it. Let's all go on a trip to find Prester John because I'm pretty sure it must be true based on the story. That was fun. This, I feel like when your solipsism is, okay, I've only got one main value and I'm going to tell everyone what that is. Okay, maybe that's interesting. But when you create a whole novel and everything is a mouthpiece for that, it's quite boring. It's just the same track.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is like a really interesting point because I think that 80% of the reviews I've read of this book are not reacting to the book itself as a construction or as character or narrative or anything else. I think that they're reacting to this one idea of sexual freedom, no limits, anyone and everything being sexually available at any time, and it all being more or less consensual. I think part of the problem going in is that my expectations were so high for a truly offensive novel. And I kind of want to like ask everyone who is you have every right to be disturbed by it, but it is just a book of ideas. And it's not, we live in a world where 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade exists. You know what I mean? this is quite tame compared to that. I mean, it doesn't even show any real sexually explicit scenes in this book. It's just the idea that, infuriates people. Maybe rightfully so, but the only idea I want to express is that there's a long history of books that exist to break taboos and make you feel icky and gross. And this didn't really rank in the top 10 of smut. You know what I mean? Of dirty smut for me.
The reason I think it's interesting to include it in this book, while I am on board for some dirty smut if it's interesting, well written, this is just creepy, I would say. But I think it's an interesting creepy because, again, of solipsism. Everything that is crossing a border is basically so he can have sex with himself. Yeah. Because I think the weirdest thing, I mean, he goes back in time and he calls the attraction to his mother a storm of lust. And that's like, whoa. But the one I think is the worst is when and I think he's just trying to experiment and provoke us. But he's like, okay, look, I've cloned myself and I made these 2 twins. Now I've raised them. I've told other people how to raise them, but I've been around. And I've called them my sister daughters all of this time. And then there's just a weird scene where it's like, whoa. But I think his point is not so much necessarily the free love there, but the idea of how separate is that person from their clone. I think they're pretty darn separate, but he's at least trying to test the waters. Not even test the waters. He's trying to test how people react to it. I think the common reaction there is probably appropriate. Whoa. But, whoa.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he's doing these weird things. I think it's interesting that he's trying to think about, okay, how can I recreate myself in all of these ways? How can I be Narcissus in so many different ways? Because I think one of the biggest attractions to his mother is that's him, basically.
Yeah, and he talks about all of the personality traits that he gets from her. Oh, I got that. It's clear that I got this aspect of myself from her, which is so interesting because it's those very same aspects that he identifies that he's so enamored with about her. You know what I mean? I don't know. I don't know. I just wish that all of the dialogue wasn't centered around all of the sex stuff and was centered around kind of the vision of the world, the aesthetic vision of what this universe that coheres inside of this book actually is, because it's bizarre and carnivalesque and unhinged. And I just don't, I want people to read this book and not get caught up in the obvious traps. I feel like he's trying to trap you. I feel like he's deliberately trying to provoke critics and readers in the same way that someone like Kanye West will say, the most offensive thing you've ever heard, but then it's obvious that they're just doing it for attention or to promote a new album or, God knows what. And I can't help but feel that at play here.
I think both of them might be a little too far gone, but I like the point that you're saying. There's one more thing about sex that I think is very interesting. We kind of talked about it a little bit, taking the neurosis out, but I think he is deliberate in what he's doing, again, because he basically gives us the Oedipal complex in a couple different scenes, but I think in one that's very particular where he and his mother doesn't know who he is at this point, but he knows who his mother is at this point. He and his mother take the little version of him, because all 3 of them are hanging out, and I think he's turning 6. So they go to the fair, and he and his own mother are having real racy discussions on the bench, and then they're going to eventually take the boy back home. But they're talking about his father going to war and dying. He eventually tries to enlist, goes, I won't say, but they're talking about the father dying. And then he's looking at himself like he has somehow completely eliminated the father. It's like the ultimate Oedipal success. He exists as the child. He exists as the father simultaneously. And I feel like Heinlein, while we might not like many parts of this book, I think he's deliberately doing it again because he's trying to look at those mores, at neurosis, and he's saying, look, I've got my cake and I'm eating it too, and you could do the same. I think he really is trying to say something about free love, experimenting through time travel, experimenting through cloning, and saying, look, this is my way of solving all neuroses. Now, we might say that's completely impossible, but at least he's setting himself a huge goal here. No more neurosis for anyone.
You know, I think that at the end of the day, the real tragedy of this book is that Sigmund Freud did not live long enough to review
read
it. Yeah, he would have loved it. God bless him. All right, well, we're done with Immortality. I felt like it took a lifetime to get through.
Life and death are wearing me out, Zach.
Oh my God. I think we're moving on to Occult Detectives for next month. So, my goodness, I'll talk to you later, Bob.
I'll see you in hell, Zach.